The cobblestones are slick with a mixture of morning mist and the city's unwashed sins. It is 4 a.m. in a 15th century German town. While the burgomaster and the priests sleep, a man steps out of a house situated precariously against the city wall, or perhaps just outside it, near the rotting stench of the tanneries. He does not wear a black hood. He does not look like a monster. He is dressed in fine wool, his hands are scrubbed raw, and his eyes carry the heavy, clinical exhaustion of a high-stakes surgeon. He walks toward the marketplace, and the few early risers who spot him instinctively press their bodies against the cold stone of the buildings. They pull their cloaks tight, not out of cold, but out of a desperate, superstitious need to avoid the slightest brush of his sleeve. To touch him is to become unclean. To eat with him is to lose your soul. To be his child is to be born into a living ghosthood. This is the master of the high justice, the Scharfrichter. To the state, he is a necessary legal instrument. To the church, he is a soul cleanser. But to the people, he is the living embodiment of death. A man who is paid to carry the community's collective guilt on his shoulders so they can sleep in peace. We have been lied to by centuries of fiction. The executioner was not a hooded brute lurking in a dungeon. He was an educated, wealthy, and deeply isolated professional whose life depended entirely on a single, perfect stroke of a blade. If he succeeded, the law was upheld. If he failed, the very crowd watching him would tear him limb from limb. The paradox of the executioner begins with the concept of infamy. In the legal codes of the Holy Roman Empire, certain professions were deemed unehrlich, dishonorable or unclean. This wasn't just a social snub, it was a legal status. Executioners, along with skinners, grave diggers, and prostitutes, lived in a sensory-rich purgatory. They were wealthy, often earning more in a single day than a master carpenter earned in a month. But they couldn't testify in court. They couldn't join guilds, and they were forced to sit in a designated shame pew at the back of the church. Consider the physical reality of his home. Because no one wanted to live near the man who handled the dead, the executioner was often granted the skinner's house. His secondary job, the one that filled the long gaps between executions, was the management of the city's filth. He cleared the carcasses of diseased horses from the streets. He emptied the cesspools. He managed the local brothel. He was the lord of garbage, the man who dealt with everything society produced but refused to acknowledge. This created a suffocating intimacy between the executioner and the underworld. He lived among the waste, yet he was the only one authorized to spill the blood of the honorable. Every time he stepped into the light of the town square to perform his official duty, he was crossing a metaphysical line. He was an outcast acting on behalf of the law, a man whose touch could theoretically pollute the very sword he carried. The stigma was biological. Historical records from the 16th century show that if an executioner accidentally touched a loaf of bread in a bakery, the baker could demand he buy the entire stock, as it was now tainted by death. In some jurisdictions, he was required to wear a specific color, often a bright, jarring yellow or a specific shade of green, so that citizens could spot him from a distance and avoid his path. Yet, there is a haunting tenderness in the records of the last meal. The night before an execution, the executioner would visit the condemned in their cell. This wasn't for intimidation. He would bring quality wine and meat, often paid for by the state. He would sit with the person he was about to kill. He would talk to them, pray with them, and, most importantly, ask for their forgiveness. This was a calculated legal and spiritual ritual. By securing the prisoner's forgiveness, The executioner ensured that the act of killing was not a murder, but a legal sacrifice. He wasn't taking a life. He was merely the hand of the law, an anatomical technician performing a grim necessity. But as the sun begins to rise over the scaffold, the professionalism of the executioner faces its most brutal test. He isn't worried about the prisoner's pain, not yet. He is worried about the crowd. In the 15th century, an execution was not a private affair. It was a theater of divine justice. And in this theater, the executioner was the lead actor. If he performed his role with dignity and speed, the unclean man remained a respected official. But if his hand slipped, if the blade caught on a vertebra, or if the prisoner screamed for too long, the crowd's role would shift from spectators to executioners themselves. The social death he lived every day was a shield, but it was a thin one. Behind the fine wool and the heavy sword, there was a man who knew that his next mistake would likely be his last. He lived in the shadow of the three-stroke rule, a terrifying legal tradition, where, if the executioner failed to decapitate the prisoner in 3 tries, the crowd had the legal right to stone him to death on the spot. As we look at the sharpened edge of the Richtschwert, the executioner's sword, we see more than just a weapon. We see the tool of a man who was simultaneously the most powerful and the most powerless person in the city. He was the only one allowed to kill, and the only one no one would dare to bury. To understand the executioner, we must look at his hands. These were not the hands of a butcher, but the hands of a master anatomist. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the line between the man who broke bodies and the man who fixed them was disturbingly thin. Because the executioner was legally permitted to handle human remains and cleanse the city of its physical and moral filth, he became an accidental expert in the mechanics of the human frame. While the university-trained physicians of the era were busy debating Greek humors and star charts, the executioner was elbow-deep in the reality of bone, sinew, and marrow. This created the healer's paradox. The very person society fled from in the streets was the person they crept to under the cover of night. If you had a persistent fever, a dislocated shoulder, or a child with a twisted limb, you didn't always go to the physician, who might just bleed you and pray. You went to the executioner. He knew how to reset a joint because he knew exactly how to pull one apart on the rack. He knew how to treat deep tissue wounds because he was the one tasked with administering the non-lethal punishments, the brandings, the ear croppings, and the floggings. The executioner's house was a pharmacy of the macabre. He possessed a monopoly on human-derived medicine. In this era, mumia, powdered human remains, and human fat were prized for their supposed healing properties. The fat of the hanged man was a sought-after ointment for arthritis and skin diseases. This was the economy of the scaffold. The executioner didn't just kill, he recycled. He harvested the components of the dead to sustain the living. He was a licensed dealer in the unclean, and for a high enough price, the honorable citizens were more than willing to swallow their disgust and his medicine. But this medical knowledge was also his greatest burden. It made the act of torture a cold, calculated science. When the court ordered a questioning, the executioner was not there to vent rage. He was there to be a thermometer of pain. He had to apply enough pressure to break the will, but not so much that the heart stopped. He had to be a master of the trap. Imagine the tension in the torture chamber, a space often located in the damp foundations of the city hall. It is not a place of screams, but of whispers and the rhythmic creak of wooden pulleys. The executioner works with a clinical silence. He monitors the prisoner's pulse. He checks the temperature of the skin. He knows that if the prisoner dies before a confession is extracted, he has failed the state. He is a craftsman of agony, ensuring that the truth is pulled out of the flesh before the flesh itself fails. This was the professional burden. To be a man who understands the threshold of human endurance better than any priest or judge. This expertise extended to his primary tool, the sword. Unlike the axe, which was the tool of a woodsman, clumsy, heavy, and reliant on brute force, the Scharfrichter's sword was a masterpiece of engineering. These blades were never used in war. They were top-heavy, with a blunt, squared-off tip because their only purpose was to slice through the neck of a kneeling human being. The blade was often inscribed with prayers or moral warnings. When I lift this sword, I wish that the poor sinner may have eternal life. The sword was a symbol of high justice, reserved for the nobility or those the state wished to grant a merciful death. But mercy was entirely dependent on the executioner's physical condition. He had to maintain a strict regime. He couldn't afford to be drunk. He couldn't afford a tremor in his hands. He practiced on pumpkins or weighted sacks, honing a specific circular swing that used the weight of the blade to shear through the vertebrae without hitting the bone head-on. The internal psychological pressure was immense. Many executioners came from dynasties. Because no honorable family would marry their daughter to a death man, executioner families married other executioner families. They were a closed caste, a secret society of outcasts. A son would watch his father work from the age of 12, learning the subtle art of the last meal and the precise tension of a noose. They were trapped in a cycle of blood. To leave the profession was to face starvation, as no guild would ever accept a former executioner. They were the guardians of the city's shadow side. They saw the prominent merchants in the torture chamber, heard the hidden sins of the aristocracy, and healed the secret ailments of the pious. They knew every crack in the city's facade, and as the day of a public execution approached, the executioner would spend his nights in a state of hypervigilance. He wasn't just preparing his blade, he was preparing his mind for the public theater, a stage where 1 inch-wide mistake in anatomy could turn him from a wealthy official into a hunted animal. The system demanded a clean kill, the crowd demanded a spectacle, and the executioner stood in the middle, the only person in the square who understood exactly how fragile the human neck and the social order truly was. The morning sun finally clears the gables of the town square, but it brings no warmth to the man standing atop the wooden stage. This is the public theater, the climax of the executioner's life. In 15th century Nuremberg or Paris, an execution was not a dark corner affair. It was a holiday, a religious ritual, and a gruesome carnival rolled into one. Thousands have gathered, filling the windows of the guild houses and clambering onto rooftops. They are here to see justice, yes, but they are also here to see the master fail. The executioner stands alone. He does not wear a mask. To wear a mask would be to admit shame, and the law dictates he must act with the open face of a sovereign official. He is dressed in his finest silks, perhaps a crimson doublet to mask the inevitable spray of blood. Beside him is the Richtblock, the wooden block, or perhaps just a simple chair if the prisoner is to be beheaded at the hand while kneeling upright. The air is thick with the smell of cheap ale, sweat, and the metallic tang of the sharpened blade resting in its scabbard. Then, the procession arrives. The poor sinner is led forward, flanked by priests holding crucifixes and guards with halberds. The crowd falls into a rhythmic, predatory silence. This is the moment of the final intimacy. The executioner steps forward and, according to tradition, offers the prisoner a final drink of St. John's blessing. He leans in close, his voice a low murmur beneath the wind. He asks for forgiveness one last time. He ensures the prisoner's hair is tied up, exposing the pale, vulnerable nape of the neck. Every movement is a calculated performance of professionalism versus pity. If he acts too cruelly, the crowd will see him as a monster. If he acts too hesitantly, he appears weak. He must be a statue. He must be the blade of the state. He draws the sword. It is a massive, two-handed weapon, nearly 5 feet long, with a hollow groove, a blood run, etched into the steel. He doesn't hold it like a knight. He holds it with a specific wide grip designed for a horizontal sweep. He begins to find his measure. He shifts his feet in the dust of the scaffold, calculating the arc. He is looking for the atlas, the first cervical vertebra. He knows that if he hits the bone directly, the sword might bounce or chip, leaving the prisoner alive and screaming. He must find the soft gap between the joints. The tension is a physical weight. In the 16th century, the 3-stroke rule was the executioner's death warrant. If the head did not fall within 3 swings, the contract between the city and the executioner was considered broken. The guards would step aside, and the mob, convinced that the executioner's unclean soul had offended God, would surge onto the scaffold. History is littered with records of executioners being stoned, stabbed, or beaten to death by the very people who paid for the show. A single slip of the foot on a blood-slicked board could end his life. The blow is a blur of silver. In a perfect execution, there is no struggle. The blade passes through the neck with a sound like wet silk tearing. The head is severed instantly, and for a heartbeat, the body remains upright, a fountain of arterial pressure painting the stage. The executioner must then perform the final ritual. He lifts the head by the hair, showing it to the 4 corners of the compass, and shouts, "Justice has been served." But the echo of this act lasts far longer than the applause. As the crowd disperses, heading to the taverns to discuss the cleanliness of the kill, the executioner is left with the remains. He is the one who must gather the body. He is the one who must wash the scaffold. And then he must walk home. He walks back through the streets, and the sea of people parts before him once again. The social death settles back over his shoulders. He has just performed the most vital service for the community. He has purged their evil. He has satisfied their bloodlust. And he has upheld their laws. Yet for this service, he is rewarded with renewed isolation. He returns to his house by the wall, to his wife who is the daughter of an executioner, and to his sons who will one day have to swing the same blade. He counts his gold, the blood money, and waits for the next knock on the door. Whether it be a judge with a death warrant or a desperate mother seeking a cure for her dying child, he is the master of the high justice, the man who lives in the dark so the city can live in the light, a silent, wealthy, and forever unclean ghost at the heart of the medieval world. The following morning, the square is scrubbed clean, but the memory of the blade lingers in the air like a cold draft. For the executioner, the spectacle is over, but the social trap remains clamped tight. This is the stage where we witness the deep human cost, the generational inheritance of the pariah. In the 16th century, the office of the executioner was often hereditary, not by choice, but by a brutal societal blockade. If you were the son of the Scharfrichter, you were born unclean. You could not apprentice with a weaver, a baker, or a blacksmith. No guild would risk the spiritual infection of your presence. Your only inheritance was the sword, the anatomy books, and the heavy keys to the torture chamber. You were a dynasty of ghosts, trapped in a gilded cage of blood money. This internal world of the executioner was one of strange, isolated luxury, because they handled the unclean taxes, fines from brothels, fees for clearing carcasses, and the high price of a state-sanctioned death. These families were often among the wealthiest in the city. Their homes were filled with fine tapestries and silver plate, yet they dined alone. They were the kings of the outcasts. They created their own shadow aristocracy, marrying cousins from executioner dynasties in distant cities like Strasbourg or Cologne to keep their meager social standing intact. But look closer at the echo of their work. The psychological toll was masked by a chilling, necessary detachment. In the journals of Franz Schmidt, a 16th century executioner from Nuremberg, we see a man who was deeply pious, a man who worried about the decency of his profession. He recorded every execution with the dry precision of an accountant. Today, beheaded Hans S. with the sword, a good, clean stroke. He died well. There is a profound, suppressed trauma in these records. They reveal a man who viewed himself as a surgeon of the state, cutting away the gangrenous limbs of society so the body politic could survive. He was the one who had to look into the eyes of the poor sinner as the life left them. He was the one who heard the final desperate confessions that the priests were forbidden to repeat. He carried the city's darkest secrets back to his house by the wall, a living archive of human misery. The three-stroke rule wasn't just a physical threat, it was a spiritual judgment. If the executioner failed, the mob believed that God had stayed his hand, that the executioner himself was the greater sinner. In those moments, the professional became the sacrifice. The line between the lawman and the criminal dissolved in a hail of stones. As we move into the late 16th century, the Enlightenment begins to flicker on the horizon, but the executioner's status remains frozen. He is the necessary evil that the modern world tries to forget. We see him in the way we handle our own unclean tasks today, the people we pay to do the things we cannot bear to witness, the ones we keep at the edge of our social vision. The story of the medieval executioner is not a story of a hooded monster. It is a story of a man caught in the machinery of power, a man who was highly educated, technically skilled, and profoundly lonely. He was the only person in the medieval city who truly understood the fragility of the human neck and the hypocrisy of the human heart. When he finally laid down his sword for the last time, he didn't leave behind a legacy of cruelty. He left behind a warning that every civilization has a shadow, and someone must always be paid to stand within it. The pariah's blade was never just a weapon. It was a mirror, reflecting the bloodlust and the desperate need for order that defined the birth of the modern world. The crowd is gone. The scaffold is dismantled. But in the quiet of the night, if you listen closely to the history of the old city walls, you can still hear the rhythmic, clinical sharpening of the steel, the sound of a man preparing to carry the sins of 1,000 people on a single sharpened edge.